The neighborhood had always seemed perfect at first glance. Rows of neatly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, and houses painted in almost indistinguishable shades of beige. On the surface, it gave the impression of order, harmony, and quiet suburban living. But beneath the manicured hedges and spotless sidewalks, an unseen tension simmered. A silent war waged in newsletters, fines, and passive-aggressive notices taped to doors. For James Miller, a veteran who had spent years serving overseas, this neighborhood was supposed to be a fresh start. After returning from deployment, he wanted peace, community, and a place where he could raise his family without worry. The small cul-de-sac offered exactly that, at least, until he hung the American flag outside his front porch. It wasn't anything outrageous or oversized, just a neatly folded flag on a sturdy pole, the stars and stripes catching the wind. For James, it was more than just a decoration. It was a symbol of sacrifice, of freedom, and of everything he had endured to come back home. To him, it was a simple gesture of pride, one that had been a tradition in every home he'd lived in. But in the world of the HOA, it was an offense. Within days, a letter appeared in his mailbox, printed in the cold, mechanical tone of bureaucracy. It informed him that his display was not in accordance with the association's aesthetic guidelines and demanded immediate removal. Failure to comply would result in fines escalating each day the flag remained. James read the letter in disbelief. He had expected rules about lawn height or trash bins, but never this. How could his flag be deemed inappropriate in a community of American families? It felt like an insult not just to him, but to every principle he had fought to protect. He ignored the first notice, thinking it must have been a mistake. Perhaps it was a form letter sent in error, but the second one came quickly, this time accompanied by a fine. Then the third, and soon he was being threatened with legal action and even property liens if he refused to comply. What he didn't know yet was that this wasn't a mistake. It was a personal crusade led by the HOA president, a woman named Margaret, though everyone in the neighborhood had taken to calling her Karen behind her back. She was the type who lived for control, her eyes always watching, her clipboard always ready. To her, the neighborhood wasn't a community, it was her kingdom, and every home her subject. Margaret had convinced herself that uniformity was beauty, and beauty was power. Anything that disrupted her vision of perfection was unacceptable. Even if it meant silencing a veteran's right to fly the flag, she claimed it was about aesthetics. But for her, it was about dominance. James's refusal to comply was, in her eyes, an act of defiance. And Margaret wasn't the type to let defiance go unpunished. She doubled down, piling on fines, sending threatening letters, and even making unannounced visits to take photos of his house as evidence. The harassment grew with each week, and James realized this wasn't going to stop on its own. He tried reasoning with the HOA board, attending a meeting to plead his case, but Margaret ran the meetings with an iron fist, cutting him off, drowning his words under procedural jargon, and rallying her loyal allies to side with her. The board voted against him unanimously, declaring that the flagpole must come down. The vote stung, but James wasn't broken. If anything, the injustice hardened his resolve. He had faced battles far worse than this, and he wasn't about to surrender on his own doorstep. For every fine they sent, he documented it. For every threat they made, he filed it away. For every letter slipped under his door, he kept it safe. He was building a case, a story too absurd and too unjust to keep hidden. And then, one evening, as he watched the flag ripple in the evening breeze, he made a decision. If the HOA wanted a fight, he was going to give them one. But not on their terms. He would take this battle beyond the cul-de-sac, beyond Margaret's kingdom of control. He would take it to the people who could shine a light on what was happening. The media, what had started as a quiet protest, was about to become a headline. James knew that dealing with the HOA directly would only lead to endless circular arguments. Margaret controlled the board, the meetings, and even the flow of information. Every complaint he raised was silenced, every appeal dismissed, and every attempt to reason met with a wall of stubborn authority. If he wanted justice, he had to go beyond the HOA's reach. The idea of involving the media first came as a passing thought, but the more he considered it, the more sense it made. He wasn't just a disgruntled homeowner, he was a veteran, a man who had served his country, now being punished for displaying the very flag that symbolized that service. It was a story people would pay attention to. It was a story that deserved to be told. So James began preparing. He gathered every letter, every fine, every piece of evidence that showed the HOA's relentless campaign against him. He documented the threats of liens, the photographs Margaret had taken without his consent, and the outrageous board meeting minutes that declared his flag inappropriate for community standards. He compiled it all into a neat folder, one that painted a damning picture of an HOA more obsessed with power than fairness. Once his evidence was ready, he made the calls. At first, he wasn't sure if anyone would care. Local newsrooms received countless tips each day, and not every story made the cut. But within hours, a reporter from a regional station called him back. They were intrigued. They asked him questions. They wanted to come out and film. The day the news van rolled into the neighborhood, everything changed. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, curious but cautious. Margaret stormed out of her house, clipboard in hand, demanding to know what was happening. But the cameras weren't there for her, they were there for James. The reporter filmed him standing proudly in front of his home, the flag waving behind him. He told his story with calm determination, explaining how the HOA had targeted him for nothing more than patriotism. He didn't embellish, didn't exaggerate, he simply let the truth speak for itself. And the cameras caught every word. By the time the segment aired that evening, the story had already begun spreading online. Viewers were outraged. Social media lit up with comments condemning the HOA and praising James for his courage. Veterans groups shared the clip, rallying behind him. Within hours, the story was no longer just local, it was gaining traction statewide. But with attention came consequences. Margaret was furious. The next morning, she called an emergency HOA meeting, determined to regain control. She painted James as a troublemaker, claiming he had manipulated the media for sympathy. She insisted the rules were the rules, and no one was above them. Yet cracks began to show. Not every board member was comfortable with the harsh spotlight now shining on them. Some homeowners, who had quietly endured fines of their own, began questioning whether the HOA's authority had gone too far. James's story was giving them courage to voice frustrations they had long kept silent. As the media frenzy grew, James doubled down. He continued speaking with reporters, appearing on radio shows, and sharing his story on social media. Each time he spoke, the HOA looked smaller, pettier, more unreasonable. Margaret tried to issue statements defending their position, but her words only fueled the backlash. Soon, protesters arrived at the neighborhood entrance, waving flags and signs in support of James' cars, slowed down to honk as they passed. What had begun as a quiet struggle over one man's flag had turned into a movement, and Margaret was watching her carefully constructed empire of control crumble in real time. But the fight was far from over. For every supporter James gained, the HOA retaliated harder. They began issuing fines, not just for the flag, but for small details around his property, his trash cans being visible, his grass being half an inch too long, his mailbox needing repainting. The board weaponized every rule in their handbook, hoping to break him with sheer exhaustion. James, however, was ready. With the spotlight on him, each new fine became further proof of harassment, further evidence of the HOA's abuse of power. The more they pushed, the more foolish they looked. And yet, in the shadows of the neighborhood, tension grew. Neighbors who once kept quiet now found themselves forced to choose sides. Some feared retaliation from the HOA and distanced themselves from James. Others openly supported him, risking fines of their own. The unity of the community was shattering, and Margaret's grip was slipping. As the weeks passed, James realized this wasn't just about his flag anymore. It was about something much bigger, about the freedom to live without being strangled by petty rules and unchecked authority. And if the HOA wasn't careful, their fight with him would set a precedent far beyond their cul-de-sac. The battle lines were drawn, the flag still flew, and the cameras were still watching. But now, James understood what was at stake. This wasn't just his fight anymore. It was everyone's. The neighborhood was no longer the peaceful place James had once envisioned when he moved in. What had once been quiet streets, filled with morning joggers and children riding bikes, now felt tense, divided, and on edge. The flag still waved proudly outside his home, but it had become more than a decoration. It was a symbol of defiance, a rallying point for some, and a target for others. Margaret and the HOA board were not accustomed to losing control. The media coverage had embarrassed them, drawing ridicule from outside the community and exposing their pettiness to the world. Margaret, especially, could not tolerate the humiliation. To her, James wasn't just a stubborn homeowner, he was an enemy, someone who had dared to undermine her authority. And if there was one thing she refused to allow, it was defiance. The board unleashed a barrage of new violations. Every small detail of James's property was suddenly under scrutiny. His grass was measured and deemed too long by less than an inch. His driveway had oil stains that required immediate attention. His mailbox, once considered acceptable, was now not in compliance with neighborhood standards. Each violation carried a fine, and the fines stacked up rapidly, creating a mountain of debt the HOA hoped would break him. Letters arrived almost daily, their tone increasingly hostile. Threats of legal action grew more severe. The HOA attorney drafted formal warnings that foreclosure was on the table if James did not comply and pay the mounting penalties. They wanted him financially cornered, isolated, and beaten into submission. But James had anticipated this. He meticulously documented every violation notice, photographed his property as evidence, and forwarded everything to his contacts in the press. Each new violation became another chapter in the unfolding narrative of harassment. Instead of weakening him, the HOA's aggression only added fuel to his fire. Still, the pressure was undeniable. The constant stream of letters and threats weighed heavily on his family. His wife worried about losing their home. His children felt the tension every time they stepped outside and saw Margaret watching from across the street, her sharp eyes tracking their every move. The hostility wasn't just on paper, it was in the air, in the way some neighbors avoided them, in the whispers exchanged on sidewalks, in the sudden silence when James passed by. Margaret escalated further. Late one evening, James discovered someone had poured paint across his driveway, defacing the entrance to his home. He couldn't prove it was Margaret or one of her allies, but the timing was suspicious. Soon after, anonymous notes appeared in his mailbox, urging him to stop causing trouble and think of his family. The harassment had crossed from official notices into personal intimidation. James, however, was not the type to be cowed by threats. His military training had taught him resilience under pressure, and though the stress was mounting, he stood firm. He contacted his lawyer, prepared counterclaims, and filed complaints with state housing authorities. He reached out to veterans organizations for support, and they rallied behind him, amplifying his story to an even broader audience. The pressure began to turn. News stations revisited the story, now with an even more dramatic angle. A veteran facing not just HOA fines, but possible foreclosure and harassment for flying the American flag. Viewers were outraged, and the HOA's reputation crumbled further. Margaret tried issuing statements, claiming James was exaggerating, but the evidence he had collected painted a clear, undeniable picture of abuse. Inside the neighborhood, the divide deepened. Some residents quietly supported James, leaving notes of encouragement or discreetly donating to his legal fund. Others, fearful of retaliation, remained silent, though their silence was tinged with guilt. And then there were those who clung to Margaret's side, convinced that rules must be upheld no matter what. The once pristine community was fracturing. Meetings grew heated, with homeowners yelling at board members, demanding answers, questioning fines they themselves had received. Margaret tried to maintain order, but her grip was slipping. What had begun as an attempt to enforce control had spiraled into a battle threatening to tear the neighborhood apart. James, meanwhile, held steady. His home became the front line, his flagpole the banner of resistance. Each day it flew, it reminded everyone that he would not bend to intimidation. He had endured worse in service to his country, and he would endure this too. But the HOA wasn't finished. They were preparing something bigger, a full-scale legal assault designed to crush him once and for all. Margaret was convinced that if they could bury him in court, the media would move on, and her authority would be restored. She began funneling HOA funds into legal fees, preparing for a drawn-out battle that would test not just James's resolve, but the very foundation of the community itself. And as the first court summons arrived in James's mailbox, he knew the next phase of the fight had begun. The courthouse was a far cry from the quiet cul-de-sac where the conflict had begun. Its walls were lined with years of legal history, its atmosphere thick with formality and consequence. For James, stepping into that room wasn't just about defending himself against fiends. It was about standing up for principle, for the right to honor the flag that represented everything he had fought for. The HOA came prepared. Margaret arrived with her attorney, a polished man in a tailored suit who carried himself with the smug assurance of someone who believed the law was firmly on his side. She wore her usual expression of superiority, clutching her binder of documents as though they were holy scripture. To her, this case was an opportunity to reassert control, to prove once and for all that her authority was absolute. James, however, was not alone. His lawyer sat beside him, a sharp and determined advocate who had seen countless HOA disputes before. Veterans groups had rallied to his cause, funding part of his legal defense, and several supporters filled the gallery, their presence a silent show of solidarity. Even members of the press sat in the back rows, notebooks and cameras ready, eager to capture every moment of the showdown. The HOA's attorney began with confidence, laying out the rules of the community, citing clauses and bylaws that demanded uniformity in all exterior appearances. He painted James as a stubborn homeowner who had willfully chosen to ignore the rules he agreed to when moving in. The narrative was simple. Rules were rules, and no one was exempt. But James's lawyer was ready. He countered by presenting federal protections that guaranteed a homeowner's right to display the American flag. He highlighted the excessive and unreasonable fines, the harassment, and the personal intimidation James had endured. He brought out the photos, the letters, the threats, all the evidence meticulously documented. The case wasn't about one man refusing to follow rules. It was about an HOA overstepping its bounds, trampling on rights it had no authority to restrict. The judge listened carefully, his face unreadable as each side made its arguments. The tension in the room was palpable. Margaret shifted uncomfortably as James's lawyer dismantled her narrative piece by piece. Each violation notice, once a tool of intimidation, now looked petty and vindictive when displayed in the harsh light of a courtroom. When James took the stand, he spoke calmly, without embellishment. He told his story plainly. Of serving overseas, of coming home to find peace, of hanging the flag to honor his service and his country, and of being relentlessly targeted for it. His words carried weight, not because they were dramatic, but because they were true. The veterans in the gallery nodded, some with tears in their eyes. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the human heart of the story unfolding before them. Margaret, however, grew red with frustration, whispering harshly to her attorney as she realized the narrative was slipping from her control. As the case stretched on, it became clear that the HOA had overplayed its hand. Their obsession with control had led them into dangerous territory, and the law was not on their side. By the end of the proceedings, the judge had heard enough. While he reserved his final ruling for later, his comments hinted strongly at disapproval of the HOA's actions. He emphasized the importance of balancing community standards with individual rights, a balance the HOA had clearly failed to uphold. The session adjourned, but the battle wasn't over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed James, capturing his steady but determined words. Margaret tried to avoid the cameras, but they followed her too, demanding explanations she couldn't provide. Clips from that day would later circulate widely, painting her as the villain of the story, the face of an HOA gone mad with power. In the days that followed, the courtroom showdown dominated local headlines. Public opinion, already against the HOA, grew fiercer. Letters poured into the HOA office, many from people outside the community, condemning their treatment of James. Donations to his legal defense surged, while Margaret faced growing resistance from within her own board. Some board members, once loyal to her, began to question the wisdom of sinking so much money into a fight that was turning into a public relations disaster. Homeowners whispered about recalling her from her position, tired of paying ever-increasing dues that funded her crusade. The once united board was fracturing under the weight of scrutiny. For James, the courtroom battle had been exhausting, But it had also been validating. His fight was no longer just personal, it had become symbolic. And though the final ruling had yet to be issued, he sensed momentum shifting in his favor. But Margaret was not one to accept defeat quietly. Behind closed doors, she plotted her next moves, determined to salvage her authority, no matter the cost. If the court wouldn't silence James, she would find another way. And as the neighborhood teetered on the edge of open revolt, James braced himself for whatever came next. The war was far from over. The neighborhood that Margaret once ruled with an iron fist was no longer hers to control. Every day after the courtroom hearing, the atmosphere shifted a little more. The pristine rows of beige houses still stood, but the illusion of harmony had cracked wide open. Neighbors who once whispered quietly about her tyranny now spoke openly in driveways, their frustrations spilling out after years of silent compliance. James's story had become the spark that ignited a fire. Homeowners dug out their own stacks of violation notices, comparing fines and laughing bitterly at how absurd some of them had been. One woman admitted she had been fined for leaving a garden hose in her yard for an hour. Another confessed she'd been threatened for hanging seasonal decorations outside her house. Each tale added to the growing realization that Margaret's version of community order had been nothing more than a reign of harassment. The pressure on Margaret was unrelenting. News crews still drove through the neighborhood, filming updates on the case. Protesters occasionally showed up, waving American flags and honking horns in solidarity with James. Even homeowners who weren't particularly fond of the attention began to resent her for dragging them into the spotlight. Her grip on the board weakened. 2 members resigned, refusing to be associated with what had become a public spectacle. Others distanced themselves, no longer willing to rubber stamp her decisions. Margaret still barked orders, still marched around with her clipboard, but fewer and fewer people listened. Yet, instead of backing down, she doubled down. Her letters to James grew angrier, more personal, dripping with frustration. She patrolled the neighborhood obsessively, looking for the slightest infraction to record. It was as though she believed, if she could just bury James and anyone else who defied her under enough fines, she could claw her power back. But her actions had the opposite effect. The homeowners, tired of being treated like subjects in her kingdom, began organizing. Small gatherings turned into full meetings, neighbors discussing the possibility of a recall election to remove her from power. They exchanged stories, compared their HOA dues, and began questioning how Margaret had been spending the funds. It didn't take long for troubling patterns to emerge. Expenses for legal counsel were far higher than they should have been, all tied to her personal battles against homeowners. Community improvement projects, on the other hand, had been quietly shelved or underfunded. Residents realized that their money wasn't going toward maintaining the neighborhood. It was being funneled into Margaret's endless crusade to punish dissent. Word spread quickly, and outrage followed. A petition for her removal circulated. Some residents were hesitant, still fearful of retaliation, but the tide was too strong to resist. By the time James's flag had been flying for months without pause, nearly every household had signed. Margaret sensed her empire collapsing around her. Her once confident demeanor gave way to paranoia. She accused neighbors of conspiring against her, of being brainwashed by James and the media. She lashed out at meetings, shouting down anyone who questioned her decisions, her voice shrill with desperation. But each outburst only made her look more unstable, more unfit to lead. James, meanwhile, watched it unfold with quiet resolve. He hadn't set out to dismantle the HOA, but it was happening nonetheless. His battle had exposed not just the pettiness of banning a flag, but the deeper rot of an HOA drunk on power. He had become a symbol of resistance, and his neighbors were following his lead. The night of the recall vote was electric. The community center was packed, every chair filled, residents standing along the walls. Margaret sat at the front, clutching her clipboard like a shield, her eyes darting nervously around the room. James was there too, not to speak, but to witness what had become inevitable. The vote was swift and decisive. Ballot after ballot fell against her. When the results were announced, Margaret was officially removed as president of the HOA. Gasps, cheers, and applause erupted, echoing through the room. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free. Margaret didn't stay to hear the celebration. She stormed out, her heels clicking furiously against the floor, her face pale with fury and humiliation. Without her, the board was left scrambling to rebuild, but the homeowners felt relief wash over them. The tyrant was gone. Still, James knew the story wasn't finished. The recall was a victory, but the legal battle with the HOA lingered. Fines and threats still loomed, and the final ruling from the court had yet to be delivered. The fight for true justice was still ahead, and while Margaret's reign had ended, her bitterness hadn't. Rumors swirled that she was plotting revenge in her own way, determined to drag James down even from the sidelines. The war wasn't entirely over, it had only shifted into its final phase. The neighborhood was quieter now. Without Margaret patrolling the streets and barking orders, the air felt lighter, freer. The recall had been a turning point, and for the first time in years, residents felt as though they actually owned their homes again. The flag outside James's house waved proudly in the breeze, untouched and unchallenged. It had survived months of threats, fines, and intimidation, and it stood as a symbol of resilience. But while the community had reclaimed its voice, James's personal battle was not yet complete. The lawsuit still lingered in court, the fines still hanging over him like a storm cloud. Though Margaret was gone from the board, her decisions remained embedded in the official record. The HOA, now under temporary leadership, had little choice but to let the case proceed. The final ruling would determine not just James's fate, but the legacy of the entire conflict. The courtroom was filled once again when the day arrived. Reporters lined the back rows, cameras waited outside the courthouse, and neighbors came to watch history in the making. James sat calmly with his lawyer, his stack of evidence neatly organized. Across the aisle, the HOA's attorney looked weary, his confidence from earlier hearings long gone. Without Margaret's domineering presence, their case seemed hollow, stripped of the venom that once drove it. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. What followed was brief, but decisive. The court reviewed the facts one last time. The excessive fines, the attempts at foreclosure, the personal harassment, the evidence was overwhelming, the law clear. The ruling came swiftly. The HOA's fines against James were declared invalid, thrown out as unlawful and The court ordered the HOA to cease all attempts to restrict his right to fly the American flag, citing federal protections that overrode any neighborhood bylaw. Beyond that, the judge issued a stern rebuke, warning the association against further abuses of power and mandating transparency in their governance moving forward. And then came the final blow. The HOA was ordered to pay James's legal fees in full. Every hour of attorney work, every filing, every expense he had incurred in his defense would now be reimbursed not by him, but by the very association that had tormented him. The decision was more than a victory. It was vindication. The gallery erupted in quiet cheers and applause, quickly hushed by the bailiff, but impossible to suppress entirely. James felt the weight of months of stress lift from his shoulders. For the first time in a long time, he could breathe freely, knowing the fight was over and he had won. The news spread quickly. Wheaton Orr's headlines declared victory for the veteran, painting the HOA as a cautionary tale of power gone unchecked. The story reached beyond the state, shared across national networks and social media platforms. For many, James became a symbol of standing up to unfair treatment. Proof that one person's resolve could topple an entire system of control. Back in the neighborhood, change came swiftly. The new HOA board, humbled by the ordeal, promised reforms. Rules were revised to be fairer and less intrusive. Residents were given a greater voice in decisions. And though scars remained, the community slowly began to heal. As for Margaret, her presence faded like a shadow at sunset. She no longer strutted down the sidewalks with her clipboard, no longer issued threats from behind closed doors. Stripped of power and reputation, she became a cautionary figure whispered about in driveways, a reminder of what happens when authority turns to tyranny. On a quiet evening not long after the ruling, James stood outside his home, looking up at the flag as it rippled against the sky. The sunset painted the neighborhood in warm hues, and for once, the silence felt peaceful rather than tense. The flagpole stood tall, a marker of his endurance, of the battles fought and won. For James, the fight had never been about ego or defiance. It had been about principle, about protecting a right too important to surrender. He had faced down intimidation, bureaucracy, and corruption, and in the end, he had prevailed. The HOA had tried to take his flag down. Instead, it had taken itself down, and as the stars began to appear in the night sky, James knew one truth with absolute certainty. Sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can spark the biggest changes.